and welcome to the first in our four-part series of Consciousness Central 2022, coming to you from the Science of Consciousness Conference here at the Ventana Canyon Resort in beautiful Tucson, Arizona. I'm your host, Nick Day, and it is so good to be back here at TSC after a 2-year hiatus due, of course, to the pandemic. In this first program, we talk to pioneering plant biologist RAJNISH KHANNA about ways in which plants might be considered conscious. We hear about an intriguing and novel approach to time travel within consciousness with Julia MOSSBRIGDE, and Julie's associate, Amber Williams, shares her impressions of her first time here at TSC. Finally, we close out with a plenary roundup from conference founder and co-chair Stuart Hameroff. All this and more in this, the first program of our 2022 series of Consciousness Central. Welcome back. I'd like to welcome to Consciousness Central RAJNISH KHANNA. RAJNISH is a senior investigator at the Carnegie Institution for Science at Stanford University, and he is part of iCultivar, which connects industry needs for R&D with universities. So here we are at the Science of Consciousness Conference, and yes, you're a plant scientist.
Right.
I think for a lot of people, plant consciousness perhaps is something they just don't think it exists, that plants are not conscious, that only people are conscious, and perhaps a few of the higher primates and maybe your dog. Are they completely wrong? Are plants somehow conscious?
Well, that's a really good and important question. I think to answer it, I will have to redefine consciousness a little bit. And not to say everyone, then when we use the word consciousness, it invokes some meaning in everyone. And I think we need to explore what that means. To me, consciousness means the degree of the ability of a physical form to interrelate with the extrinsic environment. So if we have developed tools like neuronal networks, then our ability to interrelate with the extrinsic environment is much more improved and evolved. But if you go all the way back to the very first single cell, somehow, and we don't, this is the biggest mystery, somehow a rock, which is a all the non-living forms, which are subjected to the environment, whatever is the environment, they're subjected to it. Somehow that switched to a living cell which became responsive to the environment. So that is the biggest distinction. And if you go all the way back, then that explanation of consciousness is the degree of the ability to respond to your environment. So in that sense, we can say even the first cell had some level of consciousness because it's responding to its environment. Now let's take a leap. That was about 3.8 billion years ago when we think life started on this planet. The planet was about 1 billion years old only. And so then move forward to about 1.6 billion years ago. And we think there was an ancestor, a common ancestor of plants and animals. And we know this because mitochondria, which are in both plants and animals, is an endosymbiotic result of an endosymbiotic relationship. So some prokaryote got into either a eukaryote or another single cellular and then became mitochondria. And both plants and animals have mitochondria. So this must have occurred before the plants and animals split. Now when the plants and animal split occurred during development, another event similar to the mitochondria happened, which was cyanobacteria forming chloroplasts. Now this gave the plants the ability to do photosynthesis. And to me, photosynthesis is an amazing process. It takes light energy, 6 molecules of water and 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, and makes a solid sugar that we can all eat. That's an amazing thing. So just taking light, water, and air, convert it into sugar. And this is a process which requires perception of light and sort of recreation or reforming the biochemistry that reforms these water and carbon dioxide molecules into a C6 carbon sugar molecule. So as a plant scientist, then looking at this tree of development in one direction for plants, I think then that since the plants had already taken care of the food, animals took a slightly different path. And the animals, they continued, not just developed, but continued to excel in developing better mechanisms to interrelate with the external environment. It's like developing neuronal networks and so on. So consciousness then is a process, just like photosynthesis is a process. We know that photosynthesis relies on light. We don't know what consciousness, what is that signal, what is the information. But I do believe that in space-time, there is some sort of signal or information that every part, every pixel of a form and every pixel of the universe is interrelating with. And so if consciousness is such a process, then the product is thoughts and being able to rationalize. So as animals developed, because this was important for their survival, they started to think and rationalize and became sort of better able to control other organisms' environments as well. So that's what I think. So in that sense, plants have a degree of consciousness and maybe a degree of self-awareness perhaps even, which we will never know, we don't know. But we do know that they work through chemistries and they react to the environment, they know where they are. In fact, there is a very well-established understanding that plants can tell their neighbors and try to grow taller than the surrounding neighbors. So I think yes, in that sense, yes.
Yes, it's very interesting. The point you make is so good. It's as if we've had these blinkers on. It's anthropocentric. We just think, well, we're it. We think and we laugh and we tell jokes, and everything else is inert. And then, really, when you study what life does, how life has evolved, and all the movements involved, and the branching, as you say, you sort of have to be a little humble here and say, no, well, is it something that's sort of intrinsic to life itself, which I think is what you're saying, essentially. And then the other thing I suppose we would say to that is we're struggling to sort of understand this idea of what we call awareness or consciousness, a little bit hard to put into words, but this feeling that we're here, subjective experience, here we are, we're sort of online, if you like, during our lives. And it's a little hard to imagine. Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, said, what is it like to be a bat, I think in the 70s, but now what is it like to be a tree or a daffodil or something? Can we speculate ever? Can we ever possibly know whether there is some kind of sentience in plant life?
That's a very obvious next question. So to start to address or understand this problem, I had to come up with a whole new definition of things. because when I use the same words that other people use, then they have different meanings. So I decided that I was going to build up a story to explain that. And it's not a long story, so it'll go through quickly. I think that space-time is pixelated, just like, Max Planck said, the Planck scale is 10 to the power minus 34 meters. That's the smallest pixel of space we can have. So let's go with that. Let's take that pixel. As a biologist, I'm not a mathematician, so I look at things in more functional terms. So what is the function of that smallest pixel? I think that it carries some, which is hidden to us, some information, some property that smallest pixel carries. And just for argument, let's call that Aleph. Aleph is the first letter of the first language, Abjad, also Sanskrit. So let's call Aleph is some information in the smallest pixel of space, and I call this functional unit a spot on. So the smallest pixel of space containing Aleph is a spot on. Spot on is sort of like a stem cell, like we know stem cells. So spot on can take any form, can form. Now as it forms, multiple spot ons come together and start to make a form, whether that form is living or non-living. As the spot ons come together, just like atoms make molecules, all the spot ons that are within a form constitute a spoticule. So a spoticule are the spatial properties that are inside a form. And similar spoticules exist outside. So now, as time is moving forward, what we said time is moving forward, but Paul Davies would say
not so
time
fast.
Which I kind of agree with him, because when we think of time, I think it is metamorphosis of matter or organs or organisms or objects. So the experience of time is just that we are continuously changing, which means the intrinsic spoticules that I just mentioned that have spatial properties are interrelating with extrinsic spoticules, and those extrinsic spoticules, let's say, may have pure information. But our intrinsic spoticules are constrained by the physical and the spatial properties and the memories and the genetics and everything that constitutes us. So we are constrained by those properties ourselves. So then this led me to think, well, that means spatial experience is relative. So I came up with, this means that the theory of spatial relativity. So depending on where you are, what space, what spoticule is inside you, your experience of time is going to be, or experience of extrinsic space is going to be different. A photon with its own spot-ons and spoticules moving at very high speed is going to cover much more distance in 1 second than we ever will. So that means it will experience a lot more extrinsic spatial information than we will.
Regarding mycelium and fungi, are we looking at the same kind of idea of a consciousness within that family of organisms?
So again, I think any form that has a relationship to its environment and is able to respond has some sort of awareness of what it is it needs to do and how it is going to do it. And it's through developmental processes, it's developed those mechanisms. And so I think, yes, they will also, it's the degree of ability to interrelate.
Yeah.
So mycelia, they may excel in some things that we don't. We can do it. For example, a dog, they have immense ability to smell. And so they're developed more systems like that. So their conscious experience would be different in being able to smell everything that we can't. So I think each living organism, each living cell has a degree of its ability to interrelate with the extrinsic environment and utilize resources for its own development. And I think that's really what consciousness is. It's a process, just like photosynthesis is a process. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, I think we land very nicely there. If there's anything that I didn't ask you that you feel you'd like to add, please go ahead.
Well, thank you. I would like to add, actually, we also started a YouTube channel. It's called Terra Science. And we talk about food, agriculture, and consciousness. We'll have Dennis McKenna and also, we just recorded some recently with also Harold McGee, who wrote a book, Nosedive. So he talks about smell and how the molecules of smell come from the universe. So we've had some really good discussions. So please check that out as well.
Okay, and the name of that channel once more is?
Terre Science, Terre Science.
Excellent. I hope everyone takes a look at that. Yeah. We certainly will here. Okay, Rajnish, thank you so much for being with us today. This has really been intriguing. I'm so excited by what you're doing, what you've been telling us.
Well, thank you, Nick, for having me here.
All right.
It was a pleasure to talk with you.
Great. So I would like to welcome back to Consciousness Central our friend Julia Mossbridge. And Julia, tell us what's going on in your world and where are you these days?
Cool. Okay. Yeah, thanks. I love checking in. So I'm at the Science of Consciousness in Tucson, Arizona, and it's fantastic. And as usual, and it feels like a really interesting community this year. And but in terms of, I think you're asking about work, the majority of my work is for a nonprofit that I co-founded called TILT, the Institute for Love and Time, and which, by the way, you can go to at loveandtime.org. And that is where most of my time and attention is right now. I'm also engaged with several other organizations that are involved in consciousness research, like the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I'm involved with the Society for Scientific Exploration. I'm involved with the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences, as well as the California Institute of Integral Studies. These are all sort of different organizations that are involved in consciousness research and trying to shift things in a direction for people to appreciate rigorous research and applications that have to do with the idea that consciousness is more than we sort of think it is materially. And then I have an appointment in the Physics and Biophysics Department of University of San Diego to work on our understanding of time and how our subjective experience of time relates to what we call objective time. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of that's a nutshell.
Wow, that's wide-ranging and very comprehensive. Excellent. And can I ask you about Hanson Robotics as well? Or is that in the past now?
It's in the past and it's in the future, right? Time kind of rolls it all up into a ball.
All right, so we'll come to that. First of all, tell me something about TILT.
TILT. So I woke up one morning and realized that what there wasn't in the world is an organization, a nonprofit, that could help people have experiences of travel in time. So whether it's mental time travel through your life in a healing way, or whether it's informational time travel, actually getting information from the future to help navigate your life's path, or a country's path, or community's path, or physical time travel, physically moving in time. There wasn't an organization that was devoted to that goal at the same time as it was devoted to understanding unconditional love as a human transformative motivational force. And the reason that those two seemed so important to combine to me was that, and this is, as we know, telling a story. I'm rationalizing why they seemed important because I don't know. I woke up and thought, I have to do this. But the story I have is that once you start thinking of yourself differently in time, once you start thinking about that your future self might be looking back at your present self and saying, hey, good job, why don't you try this thing, right? Or that your past self could actually use some love and could actually change your past self's experience of a trauma or a difficult time. If you actually sat down and intentionally sent love in that direction. Once you do that and play with those ideas, you naturally start thinking that unconditional love is the only way to move society forward. Because you start to recognize if you have influences from the future and influences of the past, and the ones from the past are pushing you and the ones from the future are pulling you, then how could you ever say, oh, so-and-so is a bad person, I'm not going to love them? Right? Or I'm a bad person, or I don't deserve forgiveness. There's so many factors that are affecting from the past and the future, from all around, culturally, biologically, socially, so that the only response to that situation is unconditional love. And unconditional love and travel in time both require you to drop boundaries that you have in your mind about who can and can't be loved, what love is, and what time is, right? These are boundaries that you have to drop. And so I thought, I'm doing this. And then it was very validating. Within a couple months, we got a major grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to support an application that we call Time Machine that helps people travel in time.
Okay, so, wow, plenty to kind of think about there. So when in the sort of general approach to time travel, we say, well, time travel is not possible, there is only the now, we have a very narrow point of the now, perhaps, as we understand it. But from what you're saying, it sounds as if that's not really how things are. Time is a lot more flexible, it can stretch out behind us or ahead of us and behind us, and we can sort of occupy simultaneous positions in time. does that have an ontology to it? Is it for real, or is it some kind of mental gymnastic that's going on there?
We need to figure out what for real means.
Okay.
Because people, in this conversation anyway, we can decide, does for real mean that this is something that's happening in the physical world with my physical body? Mm-hmm. Or does for real mean this is something that's happening in the mental world? Because for some people, the mental world is all that exists and the physical world is an illusion,
sure.
right? And so the way I tend to think of for real is, does it have a cause? It does it have a cause, does it have an effect? And so one experiment that actually Tilt is doing to try to discover if this can be used in a practical way for real, what you're calling mental gymnastics, which is the mental time travel, right? One of the ways to ask is there a lack of a boundary sort of in certain circumstances between the mental time travel phenomenon and physical reality, is to do what we're calling a temporaceuticals experiment. So temporaceuticals comes from temporal, which time, and pharmaceuticals. But now instead of using drugs to cause an effect that's positive for people, we want to use time to cause an effect. In other words, let's imagine the scenario. You have a stroke. There's no time. You want to get to the emergency room as soon as possible. That is true. There's no time to do anything airy-fairy or mental gymnastics in that. Like, you get to the emergency room, you handle that stroke. But afterwards, there's all this recovery time. And it's possible, it seems to me, that during that recovery time after a traumatic brain injury, a stroke, an accident, when the emergency has died down and now you're in recovery, that might be a really great time to do some mental time travel back to the time before the accident, or before the stroke, or before the incident, and actually try to see what you can heal so that your prognosis is better. And so one test of this, without actually giving people strokes, is to just look at well-being. And so we have this experiment in which we are planning this experiment and coding it right now, but it will be happening this summer, where we are asking people to take selfies and do a survey about their well-being. And then after that, they're sorted into two groups. So one group will do a meditation sending unconditional love and well-being back to their past self a few days ago when they took the survey. Another group will send that same well-being, unconditional love forward to the time when they do the final survey. And so the prediction, if you can actually direct intention in time and influence things in time, the prediction is that the group that is sending unconditional love and well-being back to themselves in time will actually have better surveys and selfies that suggest better well-being than those sending to the future. And so we actually are working with some University of Denver vision scientists on coding the pictures for well-being and how we're going to do that. And I think together we're going to come up with a pretty cool study to try to look at this.
Wow, that's hugely exciting and very on the cutting edge of things, I would say. So, but the physics of it still kind of intrigues me. I suppose in our general common sense way of seeing things, I've never been able to travel forward or backwards except in some sort of mental projection way. I can remember things that happen. I can perhaps try to imagine things that will happen. Here you're suggesting there's almost another dimension to that, another level where my future self can affect me now somehow.
Yeah, here's the proposal.
It feels so counterintuitive, isn't it?
Well,
at the moment.
Yes. You think about things this way, all of a sudden the way we normally live is counterintuitive.
For sure.
But what the proposal is that the rules that apply to physical systems are not the same rules that apply to mental systems. So there's a rule in physical systems that you can only travel at the speed of light, and that causes come before their effects. And that's kind of a rule that we agree with in physical systems. There are some arguments with it, like the people who study the physics of retrocausality would say not so much on the causes before effects, and I would have to agree with them. But just sort of as a general sort of standard physics approach, there's this idea that there's this arrow of time, and it's not the case that we become babies again. It's the case that we get older and die. Like, that's what happens, and there's like a lot of data on that. And so that's not the argument. The argument is instead that the mental phenomena are actually following different rules. So mental phenomena, not only are they following different rules, just like physical phenomena can influence mental experience, our brains can influence our thoughts, so can mental phenomena influence physical experience, and that's the one that's usually harder for people. So it's this idea that your mind, your thoughts themselves can directly impact physical reality, and because they're not playing by the same rules as physical reality, can do that over time in both directions, depending on intention. So the key factor here that makes the rule for mental time travel is intention. Where is your intention going in time? Rather than a physical body, your physical body is right here in time and right now, and so is mine. And I'm not going to deny that. I would not say that your physical body is also somewhere else. That may be true in a block universe view, right? But we experience just one location of our physical bodies in time and space. It's right here, right? That's it. But to the extent, what I've noticed in working with people and helping, and people who are using the Time Machine app, is that you start to get this feeling that the more you connect mentally with yourself in the past and future, the stronger you become. It's like the events of your life are like these beads on a string. You know, then this happened, and then this happened, and then this is going to happen, and I hope this happens. And through this process of really feeling like those are alive, you almost become the string, which is the strongest place to be. It's not dependent on any of these events. It's this incredibly powerful entity that transcends time and is woven through time. And to the extent that people can do that, there's an incredible amount of trauma healing, there's an incredible amount of supernormal capacities, superpowers or whatever, that seem to be emerging in people by using their minds in this way. So this is sort of an underutilized, we think everything has to be through the body, take a pill, et cetera, et cetera. It's an underutilized tool because of the lack of appreciation of the idea that the mind can actually directly impact physical reality.
That's a wonderful place for us to rest for now. Thank you so much for sharing all this. It's great. And I will see you in a couple of years at least for more. And we will perhaps project ourselves forward and offer something, or perhaps get our future selves to send something back to us now. Maybe
they already did. We don't have to get them to do anything. This is why we're having the conversation.
Anyway. All right. Julia Mossbridge, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's always a pleasure.
So I'm here with Amber Williams. Amber, it's her first time at the Science of Consciousness conference, and we're going to be talking to a number of people about their experiences, what attracted them to the conference, and what they're hoping to get from it. So Amber, that is my question to you. What brought you here, and what is your interest, and where are you going with it?
So the thing that brought me here, of course, is TILT, Julia Mossbridge's company, the Institute for Love and Time. That's like literally. But really why I'm here is like, I am super passionate about learning. I think like learning is like one of the easiest things that I do. And it's also one of the most fun things that I do. I believe that the study of consciousness, the study of the brain, subjective experiences is really important to my generations and the generations that will come after us, as we are very focused on how we're going to process and deal with our trauma and deal with our pain as a way of like creating a community where we're like all together and we all care for each other, across races, across cultures. I think that's ultimately the goal that we want. And so I feel like there's like lots of points of convergence and lots of intersections between trauma healing and the studies of consciousness. So. That's fantastic. That's really, that's a fantastic vision to hold. So do you find yourself drawn towards any particular aspect of science of consciousness, for example, neuroscience, or for example, say, some people follow the philosophy track, some people follow the physics track. There are quite a few different ways of approaching it. Is there any of those that you find particularly interesting? I think they're all interesting. I'm waiting for one of these seasoned scientists to find the place where all of those things meet. Because what I'm noticing, there is differing opinions across each field, like as far as like how everything works. And I think they all have something to offer. They all are like a piece of the puzzle to how everything works. What interests me most is the understanding of the subjective experience. And so I think that's more so in line with like the consciousness stuff. subjective experience is like, how happy am I? How distressed am I? And I feel like those two things, how good I feel versus how distressed I feel, is like the unit of measurement that we should be using to determine like where we are as far as our mental health, or it's one that we could use. All the stuff that I've been learning since I've been here about quantum mechanics, and yesterday I went to this really great, keynote, and it was this guy, he was looking at a cultured neuron, and he saw all these little different parts and used quantum optics, all these like crazy concepts to see inside of the neuron, and there's like all these machine parts, not machine parts, all these things that look like machine parts. And I just think that's all like so interesting. And then of course, the taboo stuff, which I think is the most fun. So like the studies of like telepathy and telekinesis or time travel, like working with Julia, my understanding of time travel has expanded greatly, and I believe I'm a time traveler and that I've been healing myself from childhood until now. So.
Okay, well, Amber, thank you very much. We'll call it a day there. Thank you so much
Yes.
for talking to us, and
Cool.
enjoy the rest of the conference. That's all I
Thank
can
you.
say. So I'm here with Stuart Hameroff. We're talking about what's been going on at the plenaries on the first day of TSC 2022. Stuart, what happened on day one?
Well, if you're talking about yesterday, there's the first day of plenaries. Monday was, of course, workshops. So depending on whether you want to call that day zero, and so let's just say Tuesday, the first day of plenaries, was very interesting. It was basically neuroscience all day. And the morning was on sleep, wakefulness, and anesthesia. And the first speaker was Giancarlo Vanini from the University of Michigan, part of George Mashour's group. And he dealt with the issue that's been around for the last 10 or 15 years of whether sleep, like when we go to sleep at night, and anesthesia are really kind of the same thing. And I've never thought so, because if you go to sleep at night and somebody takes a knife to you, you're going to damn sure wake up. And in anesthesia you won't, if it's done properly anyway. And he did mouse rodent studies and located the preoptic nucleus, which is controlling sleep. And to make a long story short, he determined that no, sleep and anesthesia are not the same thing. Different mechanisms, completely different circuits, and not the same thing at all. I was happy to hear that, because I never believed that. And like I said, it's good to know that when you're anesthetized, you won't wake up no matter what. In terms of surgical stimulus or pain. So that was interesting. And then we moved to Matthew Larkham from Humboldt University in Germany, remotely. Vanini was here live. And he was talking about pyramidal neurons and the so-called 3 waves of sensory processing. So sensory processing, except for smell, for all the other senses, goes to the thalamus, in the middle of the brain, and then for vision to V1 in the back of the brain. That's the first wave, and then it goes forward in a feed-forward mechanism in wave 2, and then from the front of the brain, it's broadcast in wave 3, and it's wave 3 that correlates with consciousness. And this happens about 500 milliseconds after sensory impingement, and it's the third wave that's conscious. And despite that, happening 300 to 500 milliseconds later, we react within 100 milliseconds, which has led many people to say that consciousness is epiphenomenal. There's no chance for free will because it happens too late. Well, you get around that with this backward time effect that we're going to hear from Roger Penrose and Daniel Sheehan tomorrow. So, but he found that the feed forward and the feedback go through the pyramidal cell apical dendrites. The pyramidal cell are the giant pyramid-shaped cell bodies which send the apical dendrites to the top of the brain for EEG. The axons go down to the spinal cord, and their sideways basilar dendrites connect to the other pyramids, making a big web across the whole brain. And this is where Carl Preben thought the consciousness arose due to dendritic interactions and interference generating a hologram. So what he looked at the feed forward going through the top of the apical dendrites and the feedback going through the lower part, and showed that if you blocked the connection between, you lost conscious behavior, or you lost the output that would correlate with conscious behavior. So there's some crosstalk within the apical dendrite. And he was asked whether this is on the membrane or could be happening in the cytoskeleton. And he said, that's a good question. He's going to go back and look at that. So we may have the answer to that. So that was a very interesting talk. And then we had Alex Procht, who, from the University of Pennsylvania, who was talking about anesthesia mechanisms and various receptors and how that could tell us about consciousness. Very knowledgeable, very, very thorough talk. So that was the morning session. And then the keynote speaker was none other than Christoph Koch, one of the world's, if not the world's, most prominent neuroscientists, who was at Caltech and worked with Francis Crick, and then has been working with Giulio Tononi on the IIT theory, and is now the chief scientist at the Allen Institute in Seattle, and also chief scientist for the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation. And he gave a very nice overview of what we know about the brain and consciousness, and was a little reluctant to go into the quantum area, although he has been involved with some collaborations which suggests he might be looking at that. But it was really a kind of a tour de force overview of the past 20 years of consciousness research based on neuroscience. So that was very interesting, and he's a great speaker, he's a great guy, it was great to have him. So that was the keynote, and then we went to brain connectivity, and the first speaker by remote was Jean-Remy King from CNRS in Lyon, who was talking about language in the brain and looking at neural correlates of language processing and whether there might be backward time effects, because often in language, when you hear the first word, you know what's coming, and it could be a cue or a clue. It could be like when you hear the first note of a song, you know what's coming, but there seems to be some kind of backward time effect going on there. So that was interesting, bringing language into it. And the next speaker was Jerry Wang of University of Michigan, and I'm going to have to, he's right here. Hang on, bear with me. Cut.
Okay.
Cut a second.
Yeah, we can cut this, don't worry.
Okay.
Don't worry. Find your space and go again. Yeah, we're good.
Dr. Jerry Wang talked about the default mode network in relation to anesthesia and consciousness, and kind of gave a big picture of how anesthesia works in his talk on macroscale brain dynamics, gradients, and the gate to consciousness. So that was also very interesting. And the last speaker of the day, last but not least, was a familiar face and voice to you, Anirban Bandyopadhyay, who came to us remote from Tsukuba, Japan. And Anirban's been doing a lot of amazing stuff. And he showed, for example, microtubules that were stimulated by photons giving off optical vortices and actual rings of light that follow the helical pathway in the microtubule, but seem to leave it kind of like spiral smoke rings, and also of light, and also magnetic vortices also. And this may be good for non-local effects and interactions. And he's also been able to detect, in previous years he's told us about going inside the neuron and looking at the microtubule and finding coherent oscillations that cell similar at terahertz, gigahertz, megahertz, kilohertz, and hertz. And the cell similar pattern being his famous now triplet of triplets, repeating at every 3 orders of magnitude. Well, it turns out now that he and others have developed a method to detect from the scalp what you would call EEG, except they get not only the normal EEG frequencies in the hertz up to a couple hundred hertz, but very fast EEG in megahertz and gigahertz, or at least megahertz from the scalp, which seems to have this triplet of triplets. So it could be that, now he's done this in animals and they're starting in humans, it could be that within a few years we'll be able to detect megahertz oscillations from the scalp, which I think will give us a lot more insight and detail into what's going on in terms of consciousness. Because it's my bet anyway that it's those fast oscillations coming from inside that correlate best with consciousness, and maybe in some way generating consciousness through a quantum mechanism. He didn't. Well, he is very sympathetic to that, so that was also very gratifying. So it was a great talk. He's really polished up his skills, and he's publishing a lot, and it was great to see him.
Excellent. That's a wonderful roundup. Just talking about nanoband for a second, like this, how does this affect you and OrcoR?
Well, OrcoR is doing very well. On Monday, we had a workshop based on the Templeton Foundation grant, which funded experiments in 2 labs, one at Princeton and Greg Scholl's lab, where Arad Kalra has been doing tryptophan fluorescence lifetimes. Where was I?
Let's start at the top. I'm blanking myself now. So nanoband.
No, OrcoR.
OrcoR, yeah.
Okay. So Templeton Foundation gave us a grant to test OrcoR, and we set up experiments in 2 different laboratories. One, Greg Scholl's laboratory at Princeton, with Arad Kalra, the postdoc from Jack Tuczynski's lab, doing tryptophan fluorescence lifetime studies in tubulin and microtubules. And you hit the sample with some ultraviolet light, and you get an emission of a lower energy, a longer wavelength light, and the time between the stimulation and the emission is a tryptophan fluorescence lifetime. And in tubulin, it's fairly in microtubules, it seems to propagate. Signals seem to propagate and take a while. And when he added an anesthetic, the tryptophan fluorescence lifetime in microtubules was decreased between the stimulus and a reporter label, AMCA, that he had on. So it looks like there's a quantum effect going on there, and that anesthetics dampen it or inhibit it. And in Aristide DeGario's lab in Central Florida, University of Central Florida, he's been studying a similar effect called delayed luminescence, where you hit a microtubule with a single photon or a brief photon pulse, not a laser, and you get delayed after a while. You start to get photon emission that lasts up to a couple seconds, which is a very long time in this quantum optic business. But it gets into the time scale for cognitive effects. And this is probably an effect called superradiance, a quantum effect called superradiance, which begins with subradiance, which is a quantum effect which reaches a threshold and then photons are emitted. And this was dampened by anesthesia. So we're trying to characterize the physics here as superradiance or something like it, maybe have something to do with Honor-Bond's optical vortices, and see if it goes away with anesthesia, it might be related to, or if not essential for, consciousness. So in the last 2 weeks, Jack Tuczynski and I have been talking with a reporter from New Scientist, and yesterday, actually, the article, he wrote an article which came out, which was very favorable to us, and so we're happy about that.
Excellent, congratulations. That's great. It's always good to hear some material step forward like that. It's
we've actually, I think, made a lot of progress in our area in the microtubule business, but other areas also, the psychedelics being one example.
For sure. Okay, thank you, Stuart, and we'll come and check back in with you in a day or two if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
Excellent. Could you tell me your name, please?
Krista Noble.
Krista.
Yes.
Hello, Krista. And is this your first time at TSC?
It is.
It is. We are talking to a lot of people here who are here for the first time. So can I ask you what attracted you to this conference?
I teach consciousness studies, actually. That's my background.
Awesome.
Subject.
Awesome. Okay, so you're in the right place. So where have you been for the last 20 years then?
Yeah, the last time I heard about this, it was online. It was the pandemic, and so it was online. And I wanted to wait until it was actually in person. But yeah, I finished my PhD a few years ago, so I'm somewhat new to the field, but I'm excited to be here.
Who are you looking forward to seeing here? Is there any particular track, or is it the philosophy track, or the neuroscience track, or the quantum consciousness track? Which one appeals to you?
I'm looking forward to David Chalmers' talk. I referenced him in my dissertation. Anything on the philosophical end, I guess. My background has to do with Indian philosophy and theories of consciousness, and so I think they provide some useful insights as to how that all might work. I've also been influenced by William James' transmission model, that the brain might transmit consciousness instead of being its ultimate source.
May I ask, what's your name, please?
Hugh McCauley,
Okay, and where are you coming from?
Seattle, Washington.
From Seattle, lovely, rainy Seattle, lovely. And is this your first visit here?
It certainly is. Yes.
It is another first timer. Awesome. So, and are you is your background in somehow to do with consciousness as well?
I have the great pleasure of being here with my professor in neuroscience, Nancy Murray.
Okay, awesome. So, is neuroscience somehow your entry into this?
It erupted out of a conversation I was having with my dad when I was studying neuroscience. And I told him what I was studying, and he said, of course, well, if you're studying the brain, you have to ask questions about consciousness. And I said, well, fuck, if I ask that in a room full of scientists, I'm going to be laughed out of the room. Brought this conversation to my professor, and she said, wait, hold on. She pulled out Sue Blackmore's textbook, and she said, read this.
Your name is? Sorry?
Nancy Murray.
Okay, and I know already that you are a professor.
I am.
Okay, and you're a professor in?
In neurobiology.
Neurobiology, okay. And is this your first visit to TSC?
No, I came 4 years ago.
Oh, okay. How are you finding it here? What's your
Well, it's really interesting. Honestly, I'm at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, and about 10 years ago, Evergreen's sort of an alternative university, and they wanted to start what's called a consciousness studies, what they call a planning unit. It's sort of like a super department. And I was a dean at the time, and I rolled my eyes, and I thought, oh God, they're going to think we're even loonier than we normally are. And fast forward about 6 years, and I wound up teaching neurobiology and consciousness, a science and study of the mind. So I came full circle, and
great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
good.
So I'm here to learn a little bit about whatever I can about consciousness. Yeah.
Because in a way, neurobiology doesn't necessarily imply consciousness studies at all. It's much more to do with biology.
Exactly, and it doesn't answer the questions. Right, I can explain how synapses work and everything else till the cows come home, but it doesn't tell me how I can think what I think and know what
Otherwise
I know.
known as the hard problem.
I know.
Yeah, there we are.
I know. It was we used the Blackmore book that year. And
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
It was great.
So that wraps our first program of Consciousness Central 2022. I hope you've enjoyed it. Be sure to join me for the next 3 programs where we'll be looking at transcranial ultrasound devices, the science behind binaural beats, the latest research into neurospirituality, NASA's search for life and consciousness on asteroids, and the philosophical questions raised by virtual reality and the metaverse. Until then, this is Nick Day saying thanks for watching and bye for now.
Thank you.